So far in this third week, we've been pretty busy recreating our classic Du Bois bar chart that you should see in the corner over here from our original implementation with HTML and SVG. And this week we've been rebuilding the same chart, but now with JavaScript. In the first part of the week, we've talked about the document object model, and we have also started to basically put in motion this recreation with JavaScript, starting from scratch with an empty SVG, using values and variables to express the key ingredients of our visualization, and then using those variables ultimately to manipulate the DOM. And the end result of our experience so far on Tuesday has been this stage at the in the solution block over here, where we've expressed all of the variables and we use a series of functions to create new elements and to set the right attributes for those elements. And all of this work so far has led to this kind of silly place where we've just been able to create a single chart element. So the task ahead of us, as you know now, is to basically build upon that logic, scale it up, and not create just one single chart element, but create the entire series of chart elements, building from the first 1750 all the way to the last element for 1890. So how do we go about doing that? As you now know, we need to use both JavaScript objects and arrays as well as loops to do that for us. So our starting point is in this section, iteratively creating SVG elements. As we discussed on Thursday, we have a data set as a starting point. The data set is in kind of tabular format. In this case, it's stored as comma separated values. And our first step is basically to convert this data set from this current tabular representation to a data structure that JavaScript is able to more easily understand. And this is what we did in class together as well. There's various ways of doing that, but for now we use this web service called csvjson.com. So all we need to do is open that in a new tab. We paste our own CSV data into it, and we basically hit play, and there it is. And what we have here now, as we discussed today as well, is we can see it starts with the square brackets here that indicates that we're starting or opening an array, and then the elements within our array are objects, and each object has three identical keys, in this case the year, the population, and the population in pixels, which is the actual width of our bar. And we can see that that width is increasing as we go down the data set, starting at 17 pixels, but ultimately ending at 407 pixels. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this data set. I'm going to select the entire data set and then copy it. And we're going to use that as a starting point now to hopefully build our entire graph. And to do that, I'm going to switch to Code Sandbox here. So this is the where we left off on Tuesday. We have our variables to create the labels, positions. We also have a series of variables to create our actual rectangle. And then the next section of our script so far is creating each individual element, and then ultimately at the very end appending that entire group with all of these text elements to our original SVG. So that's where we left things off. I have, as you know, I have copied the data set to my clipboard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a new variable. I'm going to call it data here, and I'm going to copy in the whatever is on my clipboard, and that's that data structure that we just created on CSV to JSON.com. As we discussed before, whenever you're in doubt what you have actually stored inside of a variable, you can always use console log to show it on the console here in the bottom right corner. In this case, we can actually fold it open. It is, as you can tell from the square brackets here, it is an array, and that array in this case has 15 entries starting at 0, going all the way to 14, and each of these entries we can fold open and we can see the insides of it. And every entry should have the exact same keys: year, population, and population underscore pixels. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to create for each of these elements in the array a drawn element in the chart, right? So 3 text elements and a rectangle. How do we do that? Well, whenever in English we use the words for each, that's a very clear indication that we probably want to use a for loop in JavaScript. These for loops, as we can see in the course materials, have a specific structure. And in the course materials here, I've given you kind of a nice starting point here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that over to our code sandbox. And then let's talk a little bit about what is happening here. So what this for loop is going to do, we can tell from this keyword for that it is actually a for loop. And then whatever is between the starting and the closing parentheses are, let's say, the instructions for the for loop. How should the for loop actually kind of do its work? And the instructions for a for loop are always threefold. The first bit before the first semicolon is the kind of starting position. So in this case, we're going to start this for loop and we're going to say create a new variable, call it index, and set that index to 0. So at the very start of the loop, we have one variable, its index, and its value is 0. The second argument to our for loop is, in this case, a comparison. We're going to compare index to the length of our data set as long as the value of index is smaller than the length. Now our length, as we can actually test by running console log data.length, here you can see our length is 15. So as long as the index is smaller than 15, our loop will keep iterating. And what does it do on every iteration? It will do a number of things, but it will always do this, index plus plus. And what that means is that at every iteration, it is going to increase the value of index by 1. So it's basically doing index plus 1. So it starts at 0, the next iteration is going to be 1, then it's going to be 2, etc. Everything that is then inside of the curly braces is going to be a series of instructions that will be executed for every iteration of the loop. So when we start, we're going to say let item be data. Remember, data is our array with each of the individual elements of our data set, and we're going to extract a single element in this case, namely the element that's at the position of our variable index. Now remember, index is going to be 0 at the beginning, so this will take the first element out of the array, and that's what we want because that is the first row in our table and it will be the first bar in our chart. We can see that because I have included here console.log item, and what that does is it will actually log this first item here on the console. But then something is happening. We actually get an error in the sandbox, and you see up here there's an error too. Nothing is being plotted right now, and that's because there's an error on this line 152 in my code here, and this line says let y position, so we're declaring a new variable here, be y margin top plus the index multiplied by y margin bottom. And the error that you see here in the console on the bottom right is indicating that this y margin top variable doesn't actually exist. It is not defined. Whenever you see these is not defined errors, it means that you haven't yet declared this variable. And that makes sense because this is a new variable, as you can read in the class website instructions. One of the key things that we need to change moving from our original kind of single bar element approach to one that can loop or iterate over all of the elements in our data set is we need to think about how do we actually position the y, right? So the vertical offset of each bar element. And in this case, we need two specific ingredients for that. We need the initial offset. So I'm going to create that variable as we're talking about this. We need the initial offset, which I call y margin top, and that is the offset from the top of the paper, the top of the SVG, to the first bar element. And in the past, we have set that to 15. And then the second number that we need, or variable that we need, is the difference between each one of the bar elements. And if you look in the original chart, you can see that that distance is a constant. It's always the same. So for now, you could measure it precisely, but for now, I'm just going to set it to some number, let's say 30 pixels. And then we can see how that works out in a little bit. So now you can see all these sort of red little squiggly lines under my code. They're gone. And also this error here is gone because now all of a sudden we do have declared these two variables, so we can actually finish this calculation. And that means that we can also console log the y position. And what we now see is that in the console, we see a specific log message for each and every one of our rows in our data set. So where does this leave us? This has us now at a moment where we're able to iterate through each and every element of the data set. We know that we can access the right data within our loop because we can see right here that data is changing. Importantly also, we see that the y position is updating at each iteration of the loop as well, but nothing's drawn yet. Why is nothing drawn yet? Because we haven't included our drawing instructions inside of the loop. So we have drawing instructions, the ones that we originally created, but remember they're only for a single bar element. So our task ahead now is to take these individual drawing instructions that we had here and figure out what do we bring from those instructions into our loop. So if we walk through these, we can maybe find out which ones need to go into the loop. So the first thing that we do here is selecting the SVG. And we do that, remember, by selecting it based on the ID of the element. In this case, the ID is chart. That's something we only need to do once. We only need to select the SVG once, and then later we can add stuff to it. So we don't need to do that inside of the loop, because if we would bring that inside of the loop, it would be that selection would be repeated and repeated and repeated. That's not necessary. But the next item here is where we create a group element. And what we want to do is we want to create a group element for each and every chart element. So the group will then contain always 3 text labels as well as the rectangle. So this bit we do want to include inside of the loop. And in fact, everything that comes after it, we also want to do inside of the loop because we want to create a year label for each iteration of the loop. We want to create a separator label. We want to create a population label, and we want to create a bar element as well. And we also want to make sure that we append these things to the SVG. So that final line here, we also want to include. What I'm going to do now is I am going to, instead of copy it, I'm going to cut all of this code here. I'm going to cut it out. So that's Control X on Windows, Command X on Mac. And then I'm going to go inside of my loop here, and I'm going to bring it back here. There we go. All right. So now, as you can see immediately, the chart has updated, and it has actually drawn a chart element for each and every one of our items in the data set or rows in the data set, but not quite the right element. As you can see, it's just repeating the same 1750, 1750 everywhere. So we just have to make a few minor adjustments. But what it is doing is it has already adapted or adopted the right Y position every time it's drawing those chart elements a little bit further down on the paper. And that's because we have already done this Y position calculation up here. So let's walk through the remainder of this code and see what we still need to adjust. So here, item group is just creating a new item. We need to do that at every iteration. Year element is a new text element. We need to do that at every iteration too. The X position will stay the same always, so we can keep that. Y position we already know is correct because we can see that it keeps kind of going down. But here, importantly, we need a change. So here, previously, we set the text content to this year label variable. And if you remember, that is declared all the way up here, and it's a constant. It never changes. So that's what we need to change now, because we want a different year for every row of the data. How do we do that? Well, you can see here in the console, we actually have available within the item a key that's called year. And that year has the right value for us in this case. So instead of year label, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type item, which is my object. And when within that object, I'm going to select the key year. And the nice thing about Code Sandbox and most modern editors is that it will give us an indication of what is actually available inside of this object. So in this case, I'm going to use the year. So there we go. And now you can immediately see that we're making progress because the year has now been updated correctly. So that's good. The separator element stays the same always, right? That's static. A separator is a separator, so we can skip that for now. And then we get to the population element, and there we need to make the same change. So here we have the population label. Remember that is static because all the way at the top of our document we have defined that 220,000. Instead of referring to that static or constant number, we are going to go into our item, and inside of our item we want to select the actual population. There we go. So now that prints the population numbers nicely. And then we have one more thing to change because our bar elements are all the same width right now. So instead of using the static bar width, we need to update that too to access the item. But then instead of the population, we're going to use this kind of conversion of the population into pixels that was already predefined in our data set. And there we go. Now we have an updated data set and it has created all of our chart elements. Now we can see here that it doesn't quite use all the space. That's because we were a little bit conservative here with the margin bottom. So then remember that it's the spacing between each and every chart element. So what we could do is kind of do a trial and error and just increase it. So we could just replace it with 35 and just see how the chart updates. You see it's coming down a little bit now. Maybe we make it even 40 and see what happens. Yeah, 40 fills out the page quite nicely, so we could stick with that for now. But of course, you could measure it for real if you were if you were very serious. So that is how we went from the original single chart element that we had written out kind of individually, then importing a pre-existing data set. In this case, we stored that into a variable called data, and then we use that data variable to construct our loop. So we start our loop at index equals 0, and we keep adding 1 to our index at every iteration until our index is no longer smaller than the length of the data. And that means that we are actually at the very final row. And then for each iteration of our loop, we basically have copy pasted our original drawing instructions with a very small change for the elements that are actually kind of dynamic, right? And those are the year, the population in that year, and the width of our rectangle.